In a land far away, when princesses lived in palaces, it happened, as it does, that there are people who did not live in the palaces, and among them were a group of young men who loitered. They didn't have homes in particular. They didn't have jobs in particular. They would hang around looking for whatever work they could find on a given day to give them enough money for food and some arak and to lose some money in games of sheshbesh with each other, backgammon. And it happened one day that a group of these young men were loitering near the gates of the palace. They had finished doing a small job. They were seeing if anything else would turn up when an extraordinary thing happened. The sedan chair that was carrying the princess stopped just short of the palace gate, and for one split second, one of the young men saw the face of the princess as she came down from the sedan chair and dashed into the gate to the palace courtyard. And something happened to him that had never happened before. He was thunderstruck. To him, the face looked like the face of the full moon on a dark and starry night, with great roundness and deep luminous eyes and dark shining hair, and a face that looked to him like the face of all kindnesses, sweetnesses, and all promise in the world. And this crude young man fell utterly and hopelessly in love. And he had no words with which to express the unaccustomed delicacy of this love, and so he expressed it in the kind of expression he always used with his friends. He said, "Well, I wouldn't give to have 2 hours alone with her." And they laughed and they joshed him and they assumed it would pass as they all passed. But days passed and the young man lost his appetite because the things that had given him pleasure in his life before were failing to do so. His food all tasted like sawdust. When he drank enough arak to drown his sorrow, he thought, it didn't work. He wept because he knew he would never have a chance to see the princess again. He lost at backgammon consistently, and he found no pleasure with other women who had been his companions. He was really a hopeless case. And so he began taking his sphere of operation closer and closer to the palace gate, figuring that sometime it must happen once more. His friends teased him, and eventually they simply went their own separate ways because they couldn't bear being with somebody who was so totally single-minded in his obsession. Well, the unusual did happen. A second time, the princess alighted from the sedan chair and approached the palace gate, and it was when he was there, and he did the unthinkable. He threw himself at her feet, nearly tripping her. He grabbed and kissed the hem of her dress, and he blurted out, "I am dying of love of you. When can we be together?" The princess had been raised in the ways of diplomacy in the palace and knew that you had to be kind to all your subjects, and so she addressed this scuzzy young man politely, saying, "In the cemetery," and made a dash for the palace gate. By which, of course, she meant, "Not in this lifetime, you fool." The young man had not been schooled in the ways of diplomacy, but rather the ways of the street, where you called a spade, and so he took her very literally and immediately went to the cemetery and sat down and began to wait. But he waited one day, and she didn't come. And so he thought to himself, but she didn't plan to come today. Perhaps she's busy. And he waited a second day, and she didn't come. And he thought, princesses must attend to affairs of state that I don't know anything about. Surely she'll come tomorrow. He could not remove the vision of her face from his mind and from his heart, and he stayed there day after day, totally obsessed and thinking of nothing else. Well, people thought that perhaps he must be doing a penance of some sort, and so the kind people who passed by there daily would now and then bring some leban, bring some pita, just leave a little food by him. He stayed for weeks, he stayed for months, and the weather began to shift, at which point people thought this must be a very serious penance, and they brought and put beside him a blanket or two. This went on for a very long time. And the young man began also to open his eyes through the haze of love that he had for the princess and see what was going on around him in the cemetery. And he saw what he had never really seen before, that everybody in all walks of life came to the cemetery, some to stay. And the ones who came were not always old or ill. Also young babies were buried. Also lovers in their prime were buried. The rich came and the poor came, and they all ended in the earth. And then he began to pay attention, because through the seasons, those people who accompanied those to the first and last trip to the cemetery would return and visit their graves. And he began to see the changes that would happen over the seasons and over times. He saw people come first in grief, and then they saw the grief turn to resignation. Then he saw occasional joy. He saw people come and tell messages of delight to those they'd left behind in the cemetery. And he began to observe all this in silence, while noticing that his love for the princess, who had still not appeared, never decreased. Well, he began to think about this, and this was a young man who hadn't given a great deal of thought to things in his lifetime so far. He began to wonder why it was that he still loved the princess and thought deeply of her beauty, because it was very clear to him by then that she too would grow old in time and wrinkle and become ugly and fade and eventually come to the earth where he was sitting. By that time, he had also seen the gravedigger who was in charge of that cemetery make room for new graves now and then. He would turn up a bone, and it was very clear to him that that princess would also become a pile of bones in the end, as would he himself. But the love for her didn't fade, and so he was forced, as it were, to go inside himself on a quest to find the source of beauty that didn't change. And over the years, indeed, he found it. People seeing him sitting in the cemetery without moving from that place began to think that surely this must be a holy man. And then there came the first person who came with his troubles to a relative's grave in the cemetery, and after weeping and explaining his problem to the bare earth, he came to the man who was sitting there and asked for a blessing, for help for his problem. And the young man listened. He didn't know what to do, of course, and he didn't know what advice to give. But he said, "Surely you'll be helped." And the person was indeed helped, and thought, surely this must have to do with the blessing of the man in the cemetery, whom they began to regard as a saint. So more and more people began coming to this uneducated and formerly crude young man for his blessings. And he knew very well that he had no knowledge to give. All he could give was the wish of his heart that they be helped. And many people indeed were helped for one reason or another. Now, in all this time, what had been happening to the princess? Well, back at the palace, she had done what princesses do. She'd made a diplomatic marriage to a prince of a neighboring area. She was very fortunate because they were well matched, and they loved each other truly, which doesn't always happen in diplomatic marriages. The one great grief in their lives was that she did not retain any pregnancy. She always miscarried early, and she never bore a child, and there was no successor to the throne. She tried everything. She went to all the doctors. She went to all the known healers of the palace. She went to astrologers and she went to midwives, but she received no help. Finally, one of her serving women, with trepidation, came to her one morning and said, "Your Majesty, I see how unhappy you are, and I ordinarily wouldn't dare to suggest such a thing, but I will tell you what we poor people do, and we have such a problem." She said, "Yes, what is that?" The young woman said, "Well, there is a saint in the nearby cemetery, and we go to him and ask his blessing and his help in prayer. I wouldn't ask you to go to such a place as a cemetery, but I thought you should know." And the princess said, Tomorrow before dawn, you come, and you bring me a set of your clothes with the same size. No one will recognize me. We will leave while it's still dark, and no one will know I'm gone, and in the street they won't know who I am." So indeed, that's what happened. Her serving woman came with an extra set of clothes that looked like somebody who worked at the palace, and the princess put them on, and they hurried away while it was still dark. She arrived at the cemetery, and the only person awake and sitting there was a rather ragged but very serene-looking man. The servant held back at the gate and let the princess approach him alone. She came before his sight, and he opened his eyes to see her standing there just as the sun was rising behind her. And he immediately rose and bowed to her and said, "Your Majesty, you honor me." She was shocked, because not only was she dressed in her servant's clothes, she was veiled. She said, "How could you possibly know who I am?" And he said, "You've kept your promise to me." He saw the blank look and said, "You may not remember, but it's because of you that I've become who I am, and your face has been before me every day for years. How could I not recognize you when you finally come? I have you to thank for everything I've learned and gained in these past years, because it's for love of you that I came to sit here and learn what this cemetery had to teach me, not only of death, but of life." But then he said, "No one comes to me here to recite a joy. People only come with the sorrows. What's the sorrow of your heart that's brought you here?" And she told him how she loved her husband but had no heirs to give him, and that her pregnancies did not hold. And he said, "I will pray for you with all my heart that it should be well with you." And they clasped each other's hands and they parted. The young man went back. He was no longer that young, you know. He went back to his meditations and went ever deeper toward the source that he had been looking for in all these years. People would pass and see that he hadn't moved from his meditations for a day, for 2 days. Once in the winter, they came and found that he did not move. Somebody finally touched him after 3 days and found that he was cold and stiff, and that indeed he had gone, all of him, to the source for which he had been seeking, of all beauty and all blessing. And he was buried with great honor as a saint. The princess had become pregnant. The pregnancy held. When the child was born, she took him with the same serving woman, early one dawn, dressed as servants, to the grave of the saint, to show him that indeed his blessing had been fulfilled. And years later, when her son came of age and could truly understand, she brought him to the grave of the saint in the cemetery and told him the story of his own beginnings.